So I give my feet to God, I give my roots to God. And to be in alignment with a higher idea, so I give my mind to God. But to my brothers and sisters, I give my hands. So we're well rooted in God, and our feet well rooted in God and our open-mindedness, and then our hands are for our neighbors, and that's what we're talking about today. You never see Jesus like this. He's always like this, unfortunately. But even Mother Mary is like this, and Buddha is like this, and their statues, we see them open-handed, you know, that they're of service, and have done great service for the rest of us in the world. So, this morning we're talking about increasing our good through service. And what is service but being helpful and sharing and loving? And one of the ways that I think is one of the most profound ways that we can be of service to each other, one of the most generous ways that we can be of service to each other, is through sharing our stories. Because stories are such great medicine, you know, and stories unite us. And everything that I do is really about sharing stories. That's really the whole thing that I do, is just sharing stories. And stories help teachers to deliver interesting concepts more digestibly and more effortlessly, more easily. Like, we can grab onto a story and understand it. And it's a gentle way of delivering information. And for me, stories saved my life. You know, the very first time, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. The very first time that a story saved my life was when I was a little kid. But it's been a thread through my life of how stories have saved my life. But the very first time that story saved my life was when I was a little kid and my mom was dying. And I thought at that time, I was like 13, that my life would not go on after her death. Like, I was sure that I would die when she died, you know, because I just couldn't imagine life without my mom. It was like imagining a life without breath. And so I stayed in denial, and all my sisters would be home, you know, preparing for death, and my aunts came and they were preparing for death, and there was oxygen tanks, and my aunts, they came at first, they were nurses. My mom had 3 sisters that were nurses, and they came with cots for the family to sleep in these cots in our living room. They came with stolen morphine from the hospitals, and they chuckle over my mother's bed like, we're going to keep her out of pain. And they came with wine bottles, you know. And then towards the end of their journey to our house, while this was unfolding, they ended up only carrying 2 things, morphine for her and wine for them. And we lived together in this house, and I was so in denial that my mom was dying that I would escape and I would go to school. And my aunt would say, you can't go to school, your mom's dying. And I would say, I'm fine, you know. I wasn't. And one day I came home, and it was in the afternoon, and my aunt said again, it's time, you gotta say goodbye to your mom. And I was like, I don't know how to do that, you know. I was thinking, I don't know how to do that. And my dad came, and my dad sat next to me, and he was like this big man, and I was very afraid of my dad, because I had 5 older sisters, and then my mom, and we were all little women, and then my dad, who was like a giant. I always tell Wilt that he was like 6'3", and he's like, your dad wasn't 6'3". But as a little kid, you know, I thought, you know, so my dad came and he sat next to me, and he said to me, I knew he was going to tell me the same thing that I was hearing, and I really didn't want to hear it out of my dad's mouth, because I could say that the priests were lying, and I could say that my aunts were lying to me, but I knew that a father wouldn't tell his daughter, you know, this if it weren't true. And my dad said to me, I have to tell you a story. When I was your age, this happened to me. This very thing. My mom had breast cancer, and she died. And he said, but she told me that I was lucky, and that some kids would go off and grow up and move on, and they would have to move away from their moms, but not me, because I would always have constant communication with my mom, that she would always be there for me. And he said, and she always was. And I remember staring at my dad after he told me the story, and I thought 3 things. Like, I couldn't believe that my dad was once a boy. I thought that his life had started with my birth, you know what I mean? And I was like, he was a boy? And I couldn't believe that. And I couldn't believe that he had survived the same thing that I was sure was going to kill me. Like, I couldn't believe that he had gone through that. And I couldn't believe that a story could save me like that. I couldn't believe that a story had the ability to free me. And from that moment on, I chased stories, you know? Like, I understood that stories were a good and noble and wonderful thing to share, especially if they were a true and good story. Now, sometimes our stories are not true or good, because we can use stories to separate and divide, or we can use stories to enlighten and inspire. And so sometimes we want to hold on to our little portion of the story and not make room for other people to share in the story. So we hold on to what we know, and we don't come open-minded to situations. And we become like blind men. And you know the story of the blind men. When the wise man came to the blind man and said, you know, I'm going to tell you guys a story, but I want you to guess what the story's about. And he invited them up to this elephant. And the first blind man held onto the trunk and said, I know what it's about. It's about a snake. I know the story's about a snake. And then the next one came up and held onto the trunk and said, I know what the story's about. This story's about a tree. I know it. And the next one came up and he touched the side of the elephant. And he said, no, this story's about a wall. I know this story's about a wall. And they started to fight amongst themselves and say, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. And the wise man came into them and he started to laugh. And he said, you're all right. You're all right. You're all right. And, you know, when I was in a particular program that also healed people through storytelling, the thing that they told us through every story that they shared was, you're all right. And that's what we really want to know. We come together with our piece of the story, hoping, you know, that we're all right. And our stories, when we click them together and we go, oh my gosh, I'm all right and you're all right. Like, that's just a powerful thing to say to each other. But so that's an important thing that we get from that story, is to recognize that we're all right. But the other thing, and we don't want to talk about being all right, because we want to make other people wrong, and we want to be the only one who's right. I want to be right at the expense of you being wrong, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't really feel good, right? So that's something that we don't recognize, is that we're actually all right. We're all just seeing a different perspective. The other thing we don't talk about is we don't talk about not only that we are all right, but we don't talk about the elephant in the room, that we're all one. You know, we're all one. We're all so much more one. And that's just something that we don't want to know about. I mean, we want to know about it in a certain degree, but we don't actually want to move forward and carry that story out into the world, because we're much more comfortable saying, I'm right and you're wrong. And we got it. We got the monopoly on being right. But that you know, that's actually not what happens here at Speakeasy, and that's why we've all come here this morning, because we're all desperately craving a story that says we're all right. You know, and how can we find out where my story ends and yours begins and you complete me? You know, and maybe where your story adds a bit of spice to the story that I didn't even know would kick it up a notch. Like, where do we actually serve each other in sharing our stories? So, when we don't share our stories, we can feel in the world like we can feel very separate. We can feel like things are very foreign and strange and disconnected. But stories have the ability to make us feel familiar with each other. If we know each other's stories, like once you know somebody's story, you feel more familiar and you feel connected to them and you feel supported and you feel like you could trust them. So it's amazing. And yet the world is kind of invested in us like staying separate and building walls and pretending that these walls have the ability to keep us safe, which they don't. They just have the ability to keep us stagnant and small. So we want to pay attention to the stories that we're telling, and that's one way that we can be of service. The stories that I also learned through that program were stories of me too. You know, the stories of me too. Like, I came into that room thinking, oh my gosh, I could never share my stories because I'm a bad person and bad things happened. And I get into this particular rooms that are very similar to this room, and I'd hear somebody tell a story and I go, oh my gosh, me too, you know? And I'd feel so much better. This morning on the second call, if anybody was on it, there was this woman who used to come to this church, but she moved to California. Her name's, well, I won't confess her sins for her, but anyhow, she confessed something on the call, which was so funny. She said, you know, I was hanging out with some old friends and they reminded me of something that I did way back, 20 years ago. And I thought, why did they have to bring that up about me? You know, that wasn't my best self. And they told her of a story that one time when she was parking and she had a young son. I can't believe that she did this, but and somebody parked really close to her and she couldn't get into the car and she was really upset with them. So she got the baby and she climbed through the back door of her car and she got out of the car and keyed the other car. And I was like, oh! And I was like, Well, her name's America. And I said to her, America, if you and I were together in the old version of ourselves, we'd be in jail by now. But she's like, what I got mostly out of them sharing that story was like, oh my God, I was that person and now I'm not that person. So sometimes we'll hear old stories from our past, and they don't have to be used to, shut you down. They can be used to give you a spiritual barometer of how far you've come. We've all come so far, and that's the good news. And we don't always usually take a spiritual, inventory of how far we've come. We're always taking the inventory of how far we have yet to go. Like, we're still broken, we're still incomplete, we're still worrywarts, we're still, not having a big enough God. But you know what? We've actually come so far, and that's something to remember and to celebrate. So it's funny because today I put some of the print readable and some of it not readable. I can't read a thing. I'm accepting I need glasses. So the idea is tolerance, building your tolerance for greater good through service. And there's this two-step plan for tolerance through greater good through service. Two-step plan. It's guaranteed. It never fails. It's 2 simple steps. I've used it. You probably have used it, but we forget about it. And you already know this two-step plan. So I'll lay it out for you. The first step is to love God with all your heart and all your soul. To love God. Now, that's the first commandment that Jesus gave us, but it actually is applicable in so many religions. To just have single focus on your God. It doesn't say, it doesn't care if you call that God Buddha or Krishna or Muhammad or, Dunkin' Donuts. It doesn't care what you call your God. It's just saying having single focus on your God. Put no other gods before your God. And if you will be able to do that if you have a big enough God. And if you don't have a big enough God, then you got to get a bigger God. I was in this meeting this past week where this woman was talking about her God. And her God, what she was focusing on so much was her son's addiction. And she was praising her son's addiction. She was kneeling before it, building altars to it. She was worried about it. She was saying, I'm praying to God. But I was like, no, you're not. You're praying to your son's addiction because you put it right in between you and your God, so you can't even see your God anymore. And so that's what we have to make sure we do not do. Now, we can put a broken altar in between us and our God, and that broken altar could be somebody else's problem. It could be our own addiction, but it also could be these things that we want or desire. We can build altars to these things that we want and desire. And we have to take that away from our altar. Just seek first God, and all else is given. That's the mathematics with that first step. And so that's a consistent thing that we don't just do on Sunday mornings. A lot of us get together on a prayer call every single morning, and it's like a spiritual vitamin. So it's a consistent thing, and you have to stay consistent with it because we are so apt to wander. We all have spiritual ADHD. You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, God's good, I love you, but oh, sparkly. And we're off down the road. Look at I'm more guilty than anybody. So when we start to go sideways on that sparkly endeavor, we just start to make up stuff. We just make up things, and we start to build these alternative altars, and we'll start to feel disconnected and uncomfortable and stagnant. But when you're in alignment with your relationship with God, everything else sparkles with light and love and perfection. And that's the truth and the whole truth, and you've experienced it. So that's the first step, is just to seek first God and to get a God that's big enough for you, that can hold everything that you want and desire, and trust that God and establish a relationship with it. And then the next step is, you've heard this before, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the interesting for me in regards to that statement, love your neighbor as yourself, is that he doesn't say love your niece or your cousin or your son or your daughter or your mom or your dad. He uses the word neighbor. Why? Because it's so easy to love your mom and your dad and your brother and your sister. But to love your neighbor, I heard from someone today who was like, that's not going to happen. Not pointing fingers, Carol.
Our dog has to shut the hell up.
So as you can see, it's not easy. Like, it's not easy. That's our comfort zone. That's where we're going to get our feathers ruffled. That's where we're going to say, like, no, I got my good. They got to get their own good. I don't know them. I don't know their stories. I don't know that that dog, is the only person that they love in the whole world. You know what I mean? Like, we don't know, We don't, but we do make up stories about our neighbors, And we start to make up our little stories that aren't actually any part of the truth. But what I do know is that if we're willing to stretch past our stories and have a conversation, oh my God, so much can be revealed. And you've had that experience where you thought you knew someone or something and it broke you down until you're like, wait a second, let me just wait and see if there might be an opportunity for me to engage in a conversation. And when you open up a conversation, all of a sudden, so much is revealed that you didn't know, and you have a holy moment together. And it's audacious, and all of that is just your choice. That's your choice. You get to choose. That's how good God is, that you get to choose whether you want to keep your little limited story that causes you pain and suffering, or if you want to be brave enough to engage into conversation. I have a brother who is a brother-in-law who is Kurdish. And he can speak Kurdish, so he goes over and he's an interpreter for, for the government. And he said that he's twice as valuable to somebody who wants to continue war because they don't, they don't want the conversation to happen, So it's kind of interesting, like how much the ego would be invested in, keeping us on separate sides and just holding true to our own limited stories. So, loving your neighbor as yourself takes us to a different place. It takes us off course. It takes us off our own personal agenda. Like my agenda, if I'm just thinking about my good and my family, I'm going to get to A to B to C to D. But if I'm thinking about being of service to my neighbor, it's going to take me off course and it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable. So I invited some members of our community to share stories about when service took them off course and what happened. So I'll open with this one story. I was living in California, and and it was just me and Owen, and I had this beat-up car. It was a 1964 Ford Falcon. It was convertible, but I had to literally stand in the back seat and pull it over and click it in. It had like 2 seat belts and 1 radio station anyhow. And I was living on the street, and I came home one day, and there was this really, really old man in the street with this huge suitcase hailing a cab on a residential street. And I was like, what is he doing? Like, there's never been a cab on the street. He's not going to get a cab. This is like, what's going on here? And he kept dragging the suitcase back and forth, and I was walking into my apartment with Owen, and I was like, if that was my dad, what would I do? So I went up to him and I was like, you can't get a cab here. And he didn't speak English, he spoke Persian. And he started rambling to me in Persian and gesturing and hand movements and all of this stuff. And I was like, I don't know what you're saying. And then he handed me this piece of paper and had an address on it. And I got the feeling that he wanted me to take him to this address. And, I was thinking, is that even safe for me to do? But then I kept thinking about my dad, and I kept thinking about how helpless this man looked. Like, he really looked broken down and feeble. Like, he shouldn't have even been standing up. He was standing, and he was holding the suitcase. So I was like, okay, get into my car, my beater car, And I was thinking, he's probably going to think this car is going to kill him, So anyway, straps the seatbelt in. I start trying to find the address, and it happens to be in Beverly Hills, and we drive there, and Owen's in the back seat looking at me going, what are we doing, Mom? I'm like, we're just driving this person to this address. Like, just stick with me. I have no idea. We're off course, So, we get to this address, and the guy keeps talking the whole time and gesticulating, and I have no idea what he's saying. And we get up the stairs, and we pull this heavy suitcase up the stairs, up 2 flights of stairs, and we get open to this business, and it turns out to be a traveling agent business. And this woman comes out, and she's really beautiful. And this man comes in, and he starts gesticulating to her and telling her all these stories. And she's listening to him, and then she's looking at me, and she's listening to him, and she's looking at me. And I'm like, what is he telling her that I did? Like, and she's looking at me in shock, and I'm like, what? What's going on? And then he ends his mad ramble, and she looks at me, and she says, he's telling me that you're an angel. I know. And at the time, I was like, I was single, I had this kid, I was just trying to figure it out, and it had been a long time since I had heard a kind word. And I was like, I started crying and she started crying, and I was like, oh my God, I kind of needed this. This was a mutual healing. So it's funny that we think we're off course, but God's bringing us to exactly what our ears need to hear when we go off course with each other. You know, and always check in with your internal teacher. You know, if your own internal teacher will always lead you toward doing the right thing. So many times people will say like, well, what if something bad happened on that? Well, if you, I'll be willing to say to you, if you follow your internal teacher, you can't go wrong. Like, you just have to develop that kind of faith. And that requires us to seek first God and know that no matter what, no matter where I go or what I do or what I say, I'm going with God. You know, so nothing can happen bad in that experience. Like, I'm going with God and I'm protected by that, by my own faith. I'm protected. You're protected by your own faith. So what do you think? I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, or you can go ahead and sign up for our newsletter at SpeakEasy Spiritual Community.com so we can keep the conversation going. Because Speakeasy is all about engaging in engaging conversations. Everything is better when we all share our voice. I'm Maureen Muldoon, your Spiritual Vixen, reminding you to love more and fear less, and don't forget to laugh. What do you say?